Hello guys, welcome back to our anime explainer. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel, thank you. Today is explanation of upcoming episode of Renegade Immortal based on novel. So let's start. In the past 7 years, Six Desire Devil Lord's travels started out smoothly, but as he got closer to the top, the power and complexity of the restrictions grew. There were some truly stunning restrictions. It was one of those restrictions that trapped Six Desire Devil Lord for 5 years. He turned away and quickly moved forward. At that same moment, a person stepped out of the whirlpool at the foot of the mountain. This person was holding a whisk and wearing a veil covering his face with a fairy-like, gentle aura. He walked out confidently. It was Ancient Emperor. Although he looked calm, he wrinkled his brow. At the first trial, he went through the fire trial. It took him 7 years to work his way through it. There were many monsters within the fire trial. He killed countless numbers of them. While it would have been possible to break out sooner if he had used all his power, Ancient Emperor was a very patient man. He would rather waste time fighting than take a risk. The amount of patience he had was what greatly differed him from Hunchback Meng. Ancient Emperor was well prepared for breaking past the trial this time. Even though he ran into the fire trial, his natural weakness, he remained strong and made his way out one step at a time. Although this took him a lot of time, his treasures were not used up, so when he tries to get past future trials, he will still have them. However, on the road ahead, nothing could stop him. While there were many illusion restrictions, none of them were able to affect him. After entering the second trial, Ancient Emperor let out a deep sigh. His eyes were fixed on the mountain top, as he revealed a cold smile. For the past 1,000 years, he'd been preparing for today. If you wish to enter the third trial, you must learn about restriction. This was something he had learned by heart. If it wasn't for his amazing speed that allowed him to cross the tunnel in 3 breaths all those years ago, even if he had killed all the people that were there that day, he would still have died. He wasn't like Six Desire Devil Lord, Duanmu, or Hunchback Meng. Over 1,000 years ago, he was already at the mid-stage of soul formation, and was the leader of the last expedition. Back then, Six Desire Devil Lord and the others were merely juniors in his eyes. If it wasn't for his grave injury after escaping, how could those 3 still be alive today? For the past 1,000 years, he had been recovering at the Sea of Devils, and started developing his knowledge of restrictions, so that he could attempt to enter the trial again. In those 1,000 years, he was able to recover all of his cultivation, but he was unable to advance it. After careful analysis, he believed that the injuries from all those years ago had damaged his foundation. Unless he used some heavenly treasure, his cultivation would be forever stuck. As a result, he became even more excited at the thought of re-entering the land of the ancient god. Only here would he find the treasure that could not only let him recover, but also help him advance to the soul transformation stage, allowing him to become an soul transformation expert. This would make all the hardships he had suffered more than worth it. To this end, he gave up cultivating and focused only on restriction research. He even went to many sects that were famous for their restriction techniques to study. After 1,000 years of study, he felt very confident in his ability. He even brought a few amazing surprises with him. He touched his bag of holding and widened his smile. Without saying a word, he arrived at the first restriction at the foot of the mountain. This was the first restriction he broke by force all those years ago. After glancing at it once, he stepped forward. He saw that there was no reason to waste time solving this restriction. It was much better to just smash it by force. After all, this was exactly how he had passed it all those years ago. He recalled that the moment he had entered, the weeds turned into blades. Things turned out as he expected. The weeds around him flew up, as he expected, and it flew through the red mist that suddenly appeared. It then came back around and became a rain of swords. Ancient Emperor acted like nothing happened and pressed forward. As the swords approached his body, they became covered in ice and instantly exploded. The continuous popping sounds didn't slow Ancient Emperor one bit. He easily reached the edge of the formation. He remembered that this was where a red light should appear. Sure enough, just as he was thinking it, pillars of red light appeared around him. Ancient Emperor let out a short chant. His right hand made a fist and smashed into one of the red lights. The light immediately scattered and disappeared. One after another, he punched the red lights. In less than 2 hours, all of the red lights were gone. He easily broke through this restriction. Ancient Emperor stepped forward. He was eyeing the second restriction, a few dozen feet away from him. After moving 100 feet, his face suddenly changed. The moment he walked out of the restriction, black fog appeared all around him. This was clearly very different from the red lights and sounds of beasts that could be heard from within. Shortly after, countless black swords and red lights appeared. They all flew towards him. Their speed was simply too fast. By the time he heard them, they were already on him. Ancient Emperor's face suddenly darkened. He let out a roar, and the spiritual energy that came out with the roar immediately turned into a thick wall of ice that surrounded him. Most of the attacks hit the ice wall. He then immediately retreated a few steps. He made a fist with this right hand and punched toward the ice wall. The ice immediately shattered into millions of pieces. His left hand continued to shoot out spiritual energy that attached to the ice shards one by one. The ice rapidly melted and became clones of Ancient Emperor. They all sent out numerous techniques. The restriction roared after receiving such a strong attack. It completely collapsed. As the black fog disappeared, Ancient Emperor walked out with a gloomy face. His complexion darkened as he released a strong killing intent. 6 Desire Devil Lord, this restriction must have been laid by you. The surprise restriction that suddenly appeared made him not know what to do for a moment. If someone that wasn't a strong him in that situation, even if they didn't die, they would have been left in a sorry state. The reason he was so sure it was 6 Desire Devil Lord was because Duanmu didn't have the temperament to learn restriction techniques. However, this didn't exclude that brat Wang Lin. But he firmly believed that it was 6 Desire Devil Lord, because he had completely forgotten about Wang Lin. Now that he considered how evil the restriction was, he could not help but curse in his heart. He had secretly decided in his heart that no matter how simple a restriction may look, he would tread ever so carefully. As Wang Lin slowly walked toward the mountain's peak, he suddenly paused and looked at the foot of the mountain. He noticed that the first restriction he set had been broken. However, Wang Lin felt no panic in his heart. As he was proceeding up the mountain in the past 7 years, he had laid down countless restrictions to stop anyone behind him. Even if they managed to break through all the restrictions without dying, they would at least lose a layer of skin. If their luck was bad, they might even cause the nearby restrictions to trigger. Even if it was someone in the soul formation stage, the only road for them was death. There weren't many super powerful restrictions behind Wang Lin. There were only 3 or 4, on top of the restrictions that were already there. 6 Desire Devil Lord had added a few layers onto them. After Wang Lin had painstakingly gotten through them, he added even more layers on top. And finally, for good measure, Wang Lin spent 4 weeks going back and chaining all the restrictions together so that if one gets triggered, the result would be disastrous. Wang Lin let out a cold laugh. The people behind him didn't matter. He continued moving forward. The closer to the top Wang Lin got, the more he slowed down. He had to spend a lot of mental energy to understand how the restrictions functioned. He learned every detail of the restriction before he would attempt to break them. With the restriction technique he created, he could only create up to 10 illusionary circles. He couldn't make any more than 10. Not to mention him, even someone at the soul formation stage couldn't do more. With this technique, if it was anyone else, the most they could make would be about 3 to 5 circles. The only reason Wang Lin was able to make his 10 was because of the G-realm divine sense. It was because of the support from this technique being drawn to the limit that Wang Lin was able to advance one time after another to the point where he could draw 10 illusionary circles. The jades he had used to record restrictions now numbered over 100. They were his treasures, proof of his growth. Wang Lin's will was definitely very strong. Many restrictions took him many days and nights to study and analyze, and then one day he finally had a breakthrough. Time quickly passed by and in the blink of an eye, 3 years had passed. Wang Lin's hair had already turned completely white. His eyes even sharper, as if they could pierce your soul. Wang Lin was waiting for the person behind him to catch up to let him pass first. The person behind him must be at least at the soul formation stage. This was the reason Wang Lin stopped for a year. He had been laying down countless restrictions not to attack, but to hide his presence. After a year of laying down restrictions, Wang Lin felt confident that as long as he didn't move, the other one will have a very hard time noticing his presence. A few days later, Wang Lin felt a nearby restriction being broken. His lip curled into a cold sneer as he stared back, eyes shining. Ancient Emperor's anger had not subsided in these 3 years. Instead of subsiding, he felt more and more angry. In these past 3 years, he not only had to spend a lot of time breaking each restriction, he also had to be extra careful of the restrictions left behind by another person. The thing that pissed him off the most was that when he finally broke through a restriction, it would set off many other restrictions. He almost died dozens of times. All along the way, he felt gloomy and couldn't help but curse in his heart. Sometimes he couldn't hold it in and would curse out loud. From his point of view, the person who added the restrictions was simply too vicious. Sometimes, a restriction would look like it was nothing, but when he cracked it, that crack would turn out to be the activation for that restriction. There were also restrictions that he could just walk past if he didn't try to crack them. But if he did try to crack them, they would create an endless loop of restrictions. Step by step, even knowing the dangers ahead, he had to keep moving forward to finally escape from this hell. Unless he decided to give up halfway, he could only continue to climb up. Every time he thought about it, his anger would boil. He wished he could tear apart the person that did this. Sometimes, he would feel very strong spiritual energy and spend a long time observing, but he wouldn't detect any restriction. After expending a great deal of spiritual energy, he would send out his treasures to test for any restriction, only to find that there was no restriction, that the spiritual energy was left on purpose to trick him. What made him the most angry were places that looked completely normal, but if he watched carefully, a trace amount of spiritual energy could be sensed. These would be impossible to detect unless he gave them his undivided attention. But then he would spend even more spiritual energy to check the area, only to suddenly realize this was also a fake restriction. In the past 3 years, Ancient Emperor had to deal with real and fake restrictions constantly. He would sometimes accidentally trigger a real restriction, causing a chain reaction. At the first trial, he had spent more time to save his magic treasures, but now more than half of them had been used up. They were all used to defend himself when the restrictions were triggered. His heart ached and he was full of regret. If only he had used those treasures to pass through the first trial sooner. If only if he was walking in front of that man, his path would be lot smoother. 2 years ago, when he saw 3 different types of restrictions, he realized that 6 Desire Devil Lord was only one of the people responsible for this. He realized that there were 2 restriction masters in front of him. At first he was most weary of 6 Desire Devil Lord, but now that crown went to the mystery man. In his heart, he thought highly of this person, and now even higher. He finally managed to break a restriction that took a great deal of effort. He walked out with a gloomy face. He gazed upwards. He was still 7,000 feet from the top. If it was like before, he could easily get there in the blink of an eye. Forget running there, even if he could fly he would still be forced to move with great care. He clearly remembered 1,000 years ago, when there was a soul formation cultivator that was displaying his unique magic treasure with the ability to teleport him around the mountain. When he suddenly disappeared, a purple lightning bolt came crashing down and interrupted his technique. The magic treasure was being used like a toy, but it was suddenly struck by the lightning along with the entire body of the user until there was no trace remaining. This scene left everyone in silence. To fly in the air meant attracting the purple lightning, so everyone opted to trek through the ground rather than attempting to fly. Ancient Emperor continued for a month. The distance between him and Wang Ling had gotten smaller and smaller. This was the first time Wang Lin got to see a soul formation expert break through a restriction. Today, Ancient Emperor stood only 10 feet away from Wang Lin. His gaze suddenly shifted to where Wang Lin sat today. His eyes gave off an odd light. Ancient Emperor's body was motionless as he took a careful look. He couldn't help but curse out, "This is another series of restrictions. This person is devious beyond all reason." He waved his right hand and 4 white flags appeared. They rotated once and landed on his 4 sides. His eyes suddenly darkened. Under the direction of his hands, the 4 flags suddenly started to enlarge. The flags moved around as they produced white snakes that floated to Wang Lin's location. Those white snakes circled around for a while, until one of them pointed at a rock nearby. Wang Lin was calm as he sat within his many restrictions. He wasn't nervous or surprised at all. He felt very confident in the restriction techniques he'd been developing for the past 10 years. If the restrictions were laid last minute, they might not fool the target. These restrictions took him a year to set up though. Because of this, even though Ancient Emperor was using such a unique method, Wang Lin wasn't nervous at all. He only sneered and stayed motionless. The spot that Ancient Emperor had noticed was a deliberate weak point left by Wang Lin, and if he didn't notice that, then he would suffer. The white snakes twisted themselves together, moving faster and faster, and in the blink of an eye they landed on one of the many restrictions Wang Lin had placed. The rock looked very ordinary, but under the white light, it slowly disappeared, revealing a small trail for one person to pass. Ancient Emperor stared at the small trail, but he didn't head toward it. He waved his right hand, retrieving the white snakes, then started to carefully observe the area. Given Ancient Emperor's years of experience breaking restrictions in this mountain, he deduced this restriction must have some devious killing method hidden within. If he wasn't careful, he might set off some larger restrictions. As he was very close to the top of the mountain, he would already be struggling with the current restrictions if not for his 1,000 years of studying them. After this point, it would only get harder. Ancient Emperor was very careful. He sat down on the ground and used his hand to control the white snakes to slowly break into the restriction. Wang Lin let out a snort. The distance between him and Ancient Emperor was less than 10 feet, but Ancient Emperor didn't notice him. Even with his divine sense, it would be difficult to notice him. Besides Wang Lin himself, no one else knew how many restrictions he had set up here. However, given Wang Lin's temperament, there must have been many restrictions set up in the vicinity. In fact, it could be said that all the knowledge he had obtained in the past 10 years had been placed here. After a year, Ancient Emperor was sitting in front of the open trail with an ugly look on his face. He originally thought that the restriction was very complex because it was set by that devious person, but after a month of careful study, he was surprised to find that the restriction was very simple. The sudden change caused him to feel very annoyed. Good thing he had encountered these situations before. He took a deep breath and looked at the top of the mountain. He decided that if he ever met this mysterious person, he would definitely teach them a lesson. His hatred for his man had already turned into an obsession. But nevertheless, Ancient Emperor was still very careful and still held his breath. That mysterious person was best at sudden changes. Many times what looked to be true would turn out to be false, but every moment he let his guard down, what was false was in fact true. As a result, Ancient Emperor put all his focus on his surroundings as he walked forward. He walked toward the trail, but after he moving not even 5 feet, the rocks around him started shifting. One by one, stone spikes shot toward him like lightning. After he left the restriction, he suddenly accelerated forward, sweat glistening on his brow. He turned around with a sullen face, and saw that the restriction had already returned to normal. He stayed silent, then turned around and walked away as the 4 flags revolved around him. Wang Lin's eyes were on the flags the entire time. The reason he attacked was because all these old fellows were extremely crafty. If they pass by without any obstruction, they would grow suspicious at the change. Might as well attack and put him in some danger to avoid any suspicion. After all, this mountain was full of restrictions. It was only natural to break them in order to pass. Only, Wang Lin didn't realize how powerful the flags were. They were able to create a hole in the restrictions to escape from the lights. Those flags must be Ancient Emperor's trump card in passing restrictions. Wang Lin thought for a moment and continued to sit there. His eyes were focused on the giant whirlpool at the top of the mountain. Six Desire Devil Lord was currently 100 feet away from the top of the mountain, his face dark. If it wasn't for that youngster, he would have arrived at this point 2 years ago. Even for him, he wouldn't dare to trigger the restrictions at this point. Before, there was a failure in breaking a restriction that triggered a teleportation light to shoot at him. This type of thing was what he hated the most. If he had been teleported, it would be hard to survive. With no time to dodge, he used the youth he brought with him as a shield to escape. Six Desire Devil Lord didn't care whether or not the youth lived. However, he had spent much sweat and blood on him. So when the youth was taken away by the light, he chased after him, and after much trouble, was able to recover the youth. The youth was standing next to him, eyes closed with no sign of life. In fact, the moment the teleporting light hit him, he was already killed by the restriction. But strangely, the youth still followed Six Desire Devil Lord. Six Desire Devil Lord looked back and sneered as he felt another one of his restrictions broken by the person behind him. After recording the first restriction onto the jade, he carefully studied what he had recorded. Luckily, he learned the basics of formations during the time he was a soul devourer, so he wasn't completely lost when studying this. Time slowly passed. 10 days later, when Wang Lin was staring at this area, his right hand suddenly grabbed the grass. The grass then started to move. However, Wang Lin seemed to have already seen this coming and moved with the grass. His right hand moved to the left, then it moved to the right, and his other hand joined in as well. At a glance, it looked like he was moving without any pattern, but upon close inspection, he was moving in sync with the grass. In just a few breaths of time, the speed at which his right hand was moving had reached some kind of limit, and started to create afterimages. Most of the time, when one afterimage appeared, the previous one had already disappeared. 10 breaths later, sweat appeared on his forehead and he was completely focused. He quickly pulled back his right hand and an array of red light appeared. It was chasing his right hand. While Wang Lin pulled his hand back, he suddenly began to move his hand once more. The red light became weaker and weaker until it finally disappeared. When he withdrew his right hand, it was completely numb. Wang Lin looked toward the grass. It had already returned to normal without anything out of place. The restriction here was to kill anyone that tried to enter. If one had a high enough cultivation level to charge through by force, then that red light would appear and chase the person until it killed them. After studying the restriction for a few days, Wang Lin gained a basic understanding of it. This time, it was just an experiment. He had conducted experiments like this more than 10 times in the past few days. He could only last 3 breaths the first time he tried, and he would be injured by the red light when he did. Now he could last 10 breaths, and was able to stop the red light. Wang Lin believed that if he had just a bit more time, he would be able to break through. This means that if he were to completely enter the restriction, he could survive for 10 breaths of time, and if he leaves it within that 10 breath period, then even the red light couldn't stop him. Wang Lin became excited. Although this restriction was the simplest one on this mountain, he believed he had found the right path. As long as he continued down this path, then it wouldn't be impossible to leave this place. If Wang Lin's original purpose for learning restrictions was to leave this place, then now he had one more goal. The more he researched, the more he became interested in restrictions. He had never thought about how powerful restrictions could be. For example, the restrictions in the grass here, although Wang Lin could safely pass through it, he couldn't place one down himself, because he hadn't completely understood it yet. Once he completely masters the restriction, and can make it his own, then he can place it down himself. Although it wouldn't be as powerful as this one, the strange nature of the restriction wouldn't be any weaker. After this circle was completed, all of those weapons slowed down, turned back into grass, and flew around Wang Lin. Wang Lin's expression was still calm. From the moment he entered, he always walked at the same calm pace, and even now it was no different. As he walked forward, the patch of grass parted in the middle like it wouldn't dare to block him. When he was about to leave the area, red lights appeared in the red mist around him. Wang Lin suddenly reached up with his right hand and grabbed. All of the red lights stopped like they were all caught by a giant hand and crushed to bits. The red lights quickly gathered again, but this time they formed a road under Wang Lin's feet that led to the outside of the restriction. Wang Lin's expression remained normal as he walked on the red road and out of the restriction. He let out a laugh when he walked out of the restriction. After spending all this time, he finally completely understood this restriction and made it his own. His interest for restrictions had reached its peak. He looked back at the restriction with a mocking expression and moved his hand within it. The restriction suddenly shook, and the movement of the grass changed. If one were to look at it closely, they would see that the movement was more complex than before. Wang Lin muttered to himself, "If someone appears behind me, they will have to be careful." With his understanding of the restriction, he added another layer onto it. From now on, whenever someone enters that restriction, no matter what they do, they will trigger his second restriction. With the addition of that second restriction, there was a chance that someone will die in that patch of grass. Of course, if they use the same method as Wang Lin, then the difficulty of researching the restriction would also increase. Wang Lin looked around with a cold smile on his face. He suddenly moved to another patch of grass and increased the difficulty of the restriction in that one. He kept doing this until every patch of grass had been tampered with. After doing all of this, Wang Lin pondered for a bit. He felt like this wasn't enough and sealed all of the gaps between the restrictions. This means that if someone wished to enter, they would have to walk through the restrictions. After finishing all of this, Wang Lin began to walk up the mountain. At this very moment, Six Desire Devil Lord was staring at the thick cloud before him. This cloud had been there for 3 days. No matter what Six Desire Devil Lord did, he couldn't make it scatter. His expression was gloomy. On his side stood the young man who came with him. The young man stood there, dazed, and just stared at the fog. Six Desire Devil Lord looked at the young man, and then looked behind him before letting out a cold smile. The first trial he had entered was the ice trial, which he was very familiar with. Although he didn't have ancient emperor's treasure, how could he not be prepared after 1,000 years? Back then, he said that he was able to take everyone through the second half of the ice trial. If he said it, then he was 100% confident he could do it. The truth was that 500 years ago, he obtained a treasure that allowed him to use the water escape technique, which had the same effect as Wang Qingyue's earth boat. As a result, with his cultivation and his understanding of the ice trial, he easily passed through it with the young man. As for the road of no return between the first and second trials, it was also no problem for him. Although he almost died the first time he came here, he had now mastered the Six Desire demonic cultivation method. The thing he was least afraid of now were things that messed with his emotions. He had researched a lot about emotions. The road of no return was like child's play to him. If it wasn't for him having to protect the young man, it wouldn't have taken any time. Although protecting one person made it a bit slower, the result was still the same. The one thing that made him worry was the second trial, the so-called Restriction Mountain. The reason it was called Restriction Mountain was because the entire mountain was covered in restrictions, and the higher up one climbs, the more powerful the restrictions become. Back then, the four of them arrived here with other powerful cultivators, and were able to get through. However, many died because they were forced by the powerful cultivators to test the power of the restrictions. If Six Desire Devil Lord hadn't come with his master, it probably would have been hard for him to escape death in this place. As for Wang Lin, after 1,000 feet, the number of grass patches decreased. What he saw now were black rocks. Wang Lin took the jade out and began to record again. The restriction on this rock was completely different from the one in the grass. The restriction on the grass was formed by the movement pattern of the grass. However, this rock was different. Besides some patterns on the rock, there was nothing notable about it. If it wasn't for the faint spiritual energy it was emitting, it would be impossible to tell that it was a restriction. Wang Lin looked around and found many similar restrictions nearby. If he wanted to, he could get through them by walking through the gaps between each restriction. However, compared to leaving, Wang Lin preferred to gain a complete understanding of these restrictions instead. He knew that passing through this area was easy, but he also knew he had to spend a lot of time and effort here if he wished to reach the top of the mountain. Wang Lin began to carefully research the restriction. There was no sense of time in the mountain, so in the blink of an eye, 7 years had passed. On this day, Wang Lin drank some spirit liquid, as he stood on a rock on the side of the mountain. In these past 7 years, half of Wang Lin's hair had turned white. He had devoted himself to studying restrictions, causing him to be mentally stressed all the time. 4 years ago, his hair started turning white at the root. However, his divine sense also became more powerful under this stress, and he unknowingly entered the mid-stage of core formation. He was now one step closer to the nascent soul stage. His eyes were even more sharp, and his temperament had changed greatly. If Wang Lin was like never-melting ice 7 years ago, then now he was also impossible to see through. This feeling came from his eyes. His eyes seemed to be able to see everything, and there were stars within them that would sometimes flash. If Duan Muji saw Wang Lin now, he probably wouldn't believe it. These were the divine sense eyes that were only obtained once someone had reached a certain level of mastery in restrictions. Wang spent these past 7 years refining his eyes. In these 7 years, he had encountered countless restrictions. All of them required him to carefully study and examine them. He was almost killed by those restrictions many times. This was especially true for some restrictions that clearly had other restrictions added onto them. Luckily, Wang Lin had always been cautious, so he noticed that these restrictions were different than the ones from the mountain. After carefully studying them, he realized that the person above him was also an expert in restrictions. Just from looking at the restrictions, Wang Lin could see that this person's understanding of restrictions was much deeper than his. However, Wang Lin wasn't scared at all. His interest in leaving the second trial had decreased a lot. From his point of view, this was the dreamland for learning restrictions. The way the restrictions became progressively more complex meant that a person could start at the basics and work their way up. This kind of place was almost impossible to find. The restrictions went from simple to difficult. It was a very valuable place. With great concentration, Wang Lin walked the path in the mountain. It had been 7 years. Every time he broke a restriction, he would change it a little and add on a few more. If the path he took was like hell and full of danger at every step, he would make it feel like the grass had turned to ice. Everything combined would make it feel like the heavens and earth were swallowing you. If there was anyone unlucky enough to run into them, they would still lose a layer of skin if they didn't die. In these 7 years, Wang Lin changed a lot in regards to his restriction technique. He had gained a lot of enlightenment. Now he could easily wield all of the restrictions broken by him as his own, and more effectively than they originally were. This surprised Wang Lin and increased his interest even more. After all, the only way to exit this mountain was through restriction techniques. In the past 7 years of his restriction research, Wang Lin never just made simple observations. He was able to produce his own method of deducing how to get past the restrictions. This method was the result of countless trials and errors. He always worked slowly from the starting point, never missing a single detail. While he progressed, each of his steps forward were firm. When it came to rare and difficult restrictions, he always started from the basics and slowly progressed through. Without any impatience in his heart, he slowly developed the mindset to practice restriction techniques. There were many who could use restriction techniques, however, there are very few that have a deep understanding of them. Aside from a few old experts, no one else could match Wang Lin in restriction techniques. Even Wang Lin himself was very confused. It seemed like his mediocre talent didn't matter at all when practicing restriction techniques. At this moment, Wang Lin sat cross-legged on a large rock. He was staring straight ahead at the cloud in the distance. The cloud was motionless. As of 2 days ago, Wang Lin started staring at the cloud in deep meditation. He took out a jade and recorded a few words on it, then he drew on the ground. This cloud appeared to be very subtle to Wang Lin. His restrictions were all around the mountain. If anyone wanted to get past them, they would have to fly through and rely on their luck to survive. If it was 7 years ago, Wang Lin would need to use small animals to experience a breakthrough in the restriction technique. However, with his now developed understanding of restrictions, especially with his soul-piercing eyes, he only needed to stare at the cloud for a bit. While not fully comprehending the restriction, he was able to tell what restriction was in place. It was one that prevented flying. In this way, the cloud restriction became even more ingenious. If there were no clouds, while the restriction would still be difficult to break, one would not be completely lost. However, the cloud covered the center of the restriction. This increased the unknown variable within this restriction. Even in this situation, Wang Lin's heart didn't become flustered. His eyes gleamed as he stared at the cloud. Suddenly, his hand started moving in a blur in front of him. After images of his hand started appearing until it looked like he had thousands of hands. These after images started to tremble, and then began to spread rapidly. The after images created by Wang Lin's hand formed a illusionary circle. He suddenly paused and thrusted his right hand forward. The illusionary circle formed by the after images flew toward the cloud. After the illusionary circle entered the cloud, it started to dissipate. The illusionary caused waves to surge through the cloud. Wang Lin sat cross-legged, not even glancing at the clouds. With his eyes closed, he slowly started to frown. This illusionary circle was a technique developed by Wang Lin to break restrictions. After 7 years of research and improvement, he had mastered this technique. After the time it takes for a full incense stick to burn past, he put away the jade. He stared at where the cloud was and saw a broken bridge only 10 feet away from him. This was the true face of the restriction. As Wang Lin was about to step forward, he carefully scanned the bridge. His eyes landed on a small tree growing next to the broken bridge. With Wang Lin's experience from breaking restrictions for the past 7 years, he noticed that there was something wrong with the small tree. In all of the restrictions that Wang Lin had come across in this mountain, although very rarely, he would sometimes find 2 restrictions stacked on top of each other. But this restriction was very different from the precious restrictions. This one must have been added by someone else. He himself had done the same thing many times in the past 7 years. This little tree must have been placed here by someone else. Wang Lin laughed coldly. He looked at the restriction on the little tree once and immediately recognized the same level of foul play he had encountered several times before. They were all created by the same person. About 4 years ago, someone started to try to obstruct him with restrictions. After breaking them one by one, he had a good understanding of their restrictions. The restrictions in the mountain normally didn't activate unless he touched them. However, the restrictions set by this person were very different. The moment he entered their range, they immediately attacked him. If its attacks ended up being in vain, it would self-destruct and activate all of the restrictions nearby, trapping the person in a prison of restrictions. Wang Lin narrowed his eyes as he stared at the little tree. He sent out 3 illusionary circles. They landed on top of the little tree. The little tree shook a little and the leaves started to fall off. The trunk quickly turned dark. After some time, it finally started to bend. Wang Lin's illusionary circle contained numerous restrictions. Its main role was to break restrictions. Thus, the restriction on the little tree broke, layer by layer. A cold light flashed in Wang Lin's eye. He quickly took the black sword out of his bag of holding and sent it towards the tree. At the same time, the bent tree trunk flew at Wang Lin. The black sword suddenly flashed by, brushing past the tree trunk and slicing it in two. When the tree trunk fell to the ground, it curled up and gradually revealed itself to be a brown centipede. The centipede twisted a few times before turning into a cloud of black smoke. This black smoke gave off the feeling of death that would cause people to panic. However, it disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Wang Lin thought with a dignified look in his eyes. This was the first time he had seen a restriction that used a spirit beast, where the spirit beast's body created a black smoke that would cause panic. He felt very familiar with this method. He was able to tell that this restriction, and a few others before this, were set up by the same person. It was really obvious that that person rarely used this kind of restriction. It wasn't much stronger than the rest, but it was much more ingenious. If someone carelessly walked by, it would be hard to avoid death. 6 Desire Devil Lord. Wang Lin whispered. He knew why this felt so familiar to him. Back then, in the void, 6 Desire Devil Lord wanted to use him to test his outlandish technique. 6 Desire Devil Lord looked at Ancient Emperor. He hadn't expected him to get up here so quickly. If he had enough time for 1 incense stick to burn, he could have finished the whirlpool restriction. Although it would only last 3 breaths, it was more than enough for him. But at this moment, Ancient Emperor appearing was outside of his expectations. This forced him to change his plan. Ancient Emperor's eyes shrunk when he saw the whirlpool. He remembered that this was exactly the same technique that 6 Desire Devil Lord's teacher, Sky Devil, used. It was a restriction technique that could bypass hundreds of restrictions. 6 Desire, Ancient Emperor's eyes were dull as he suppressed his anger. Compared to 6 Desire Devil Lord, he wanted to find the mysterious youth even more. His eyes swept the area and landed on the youth. He frowned and said, "Is he the mysterious youth?" However, there is no feeling of life coming from him. The corner of 6 Desire Devil Lord's mouth twitched and he gently said, "I never expected Brother Ancient Emperor would arrive here as well. This is a cause for celebration." Ancient Emperor smirked. While suppressing his anger, he said, "It was all thanks to the help that you and this youth left behind that this old bag of bones was able to make it here." 6 Desire Devil Lord looked at the youth, his eyes turned cold, and said, "Brother Ancient Emperor, what do you mean?" Ancient Emperor's face was sullen, eyeing the restrictions set up by 6 Desire Devil Lord. He didn't say a word. 6 Desire Devil Lord sneered in his heart, but there was no change in his expression. He laughed. "Brother Ancient Emperor, in this place there is only 2 of us. With our strength, if both of us were to fight, we would definitely trigger many larger restrictions." Ancient Emperor stayed silent, then said, "First, remove the restrictions and let me come over." 6 Desire Devil Lord faltered a bit as he saw the 4 flags rotating around Ancient Emperor. Ancient Emperor gave the whirlpool a quick look and sneered, "This tunnel restriction doesn't seem to be complete. If I were to trigger the nearby restrictions, would the passage close permanently?" 6 Desire Devil Lord's face didn't change at all. He nodded his head and smiled. He waved his hand and the restrictions split in half. Since these restrictions were broken by him, he would naturally be able to set them up again. Ancient Emperor walked forward without saying a word. His eyes never left 6 Desire Devil Lord. After he walked more than halfway through the restrictions, Ancient Emperor suddenly moved his body. The 4 white flags created a tunnel, and Ancient Emperor quickly entered it. The moment Ancient Emperor suddenly made a move, 6 Desire Devil Lord closed his hand and the restriction was set up again and activated. But he never thought that Ancient Emperor's flags were so powerful. The moment the restrictions were set up and activated, Ancient Emperor came out of the tunnel and was only 10 feet away. The moment he appeared, Ancient Emperor didn't hesitate. A ray of light shot out from his mouth. The light wasn't aimed at Six Desire Devil Lord, but at the youth in the middle of the whirlpool. The reason Ancient Emperor showed his life-saving treasure was because his hate for the youth was just monstrous. Six Desire Devil Lord's expression changed. Both his hands clapped onto a printed paper and he yelled, "Desire." Suddenly, yellow light came out of the stomach of the youth, turning into a sword. It slammed into the light shot by Ancient Emperor. Six Desire Devil Lord also had a sullen look. He sneered, "It doesn't matter if it's possible, it's better if the two of us quickly leave this place." Right as he finished speaking, his face suddenly changed. Not caring about Ancient Emperor, he suddenly appeared next to the youth, grabbed his arm, and was about to step into the whirlpool. "Too late," said a cold voice from all sides. Suddenly, within 300 feet of the mountain top, numerous illusionary circles appeared. They smashed through all the restrictions nearby. Wang Lin was sitting on a boulder 500 feet away. For the past year, he had been storing up illusionary circles within his many restrictions. Now he suddenly released his restrictions, and all the illusionary circles came out of them and crashed into all the restrictions within 200 feet of him. One could even say that every restriction Wang Lin had set up was to store illusionary circles. Under all the pressure caused by the illusionary circles, Six Desire Devil Lord and Ancient Emperor was suddenly put into a disadvantage. Six Desire Devil Lord was very good at tricking people, but in the end he was tricked by someone else. As for Ancient Emperor, he was misled from the beginning because he thought deep down in his heart that Wang Lin was just too weak. It was no wonder this misunderstanding happened. At that moment, he finally came to a realization. There was deep hatred in his eyes. All the restrictions within 300 feet of the mountaintop were activated. Suddenly, rays of light, giant fireballs, magic swords that would even cause immortal gods to have a headache, and spots of colorful light that gave off very strong death auras came from all sides. With all the widespread restrictions going off, it even triggered the restriction in the sky. Suddenly, massive black clouds appeared, descending to the mountain top. Flashes of lightning could be seen. Even more, there was a ring of black light formed 300 feet around the mountain top that shot upwards and contracted. Everything that the black ring touched was destroyed, even the restrictions set up by the mountain. Even Wang Lin was stunned by what happened. He never imagined that setting off so many restrictions would have such a weird effect, especially that black ring that contained very strong destructive power. Once the restrictions near the mountain top were triggered, they had only one mission: to kill every living thing within the area. According to Wang Lin's analysis, there were many restrictions set up between him and the other two. If Ancient Emperor and Six Desire Devil Lord gave up on the mountain and came down to find him, then around him he still had hundreds of illusionary circles, enough to trigger all the restrictions in the mountain. If anything, he could just leave the mountain and wait for all the restrictions to quiet down before ascending the mountain again. But now, it seemed all his preparation was pointless. Unless Six Desire Devil Lord and Ancient Emperor were crazy, they would never consider coming back here, as the ring of black light that was quickly flying up and contracting was far too intimidating. According to Wang Lin's plan, whether Six Desire Devil Lord or Ancient Emperor made it past the second barrier was of no importance. The reason why he let Ancient Emperor pass was because the restrictions up ahead were simply too hard for him to crack. He also wanted to test just how powerful the restrictions within the last 500 feet were to help him crack them in the future. Six Desire Devil Lord's eyes were red. He grabbed the youth next to him with his right hand and raised him up to block the purple ball of lightning. As the lightning was about to strike, the youth's eyes suddenly opened. There was no light in these eyes. He opened his mouth and swallowed the lightning ball. Shortly after, there was a thunderous roar coming from inside the youth as his skin cracked. Six Desire Devil Lord was very excited, as he didn't expect this thing to be able to block the purple lightning. He quickly continued forward. Wang Lin's pupils shrank as he stared at the body of the youth. He felt a flash of fear in his heart. Six Desire Devil Lord was clearly afraid of the purple lightning, yet this youth's body was not destroyed by it. Wang Lin sighed. He once again looked at the black light. He clenched his teeth and produced more than 10 illusionary circles that he sent toward the black light and began his analysis. Ancient Emperor shot one look at the youth, and fear filled his heart. It seemed Six Desire Devil Lord didn't lie to him, and the youth was really that thing. A look of greed appeared in his eyes. He was only 50 feet from the mountain top. He took a deep breath and waved his hand. The 8 flags started to spin faster, and suddenly a black tunnel appeared before him. He moved into the black tunnel and appeared at the top of the mountain. He let out a laugh. As he was about to enter the exit of the second realm, 6 Desire Devil Lord arrived as well. How could the restrictions within 100 feet of the peak be so easily passed? The only reason those two were able to rush here was not only because of their own cultivation level, but also the treasures that they held. These 2 things were the 2 secret weapons the two brought this time to break through the realms. Not to mention the body of the youth, the flag's ancient emperor were from a sect in the rank 5 country of Xiozhen famous for its restrictions. The 8 flags could form numerous different restrictions depending on the combination. If it wasn't for ancient emperor not knowing many combinations, his trip up the mountain wouldn't be as pathetic. However, in terms of speed of comprehension between the 3, ancient emperor was still the fastest. That in of itself presented a problem. These flags took ancient emperor a great deal of effort to acquire. If he had these flags 1,000 years ago, then the death and injury rate wouldn't have been so high. But needless to say, the restrictions within 100 feet were no joke. As the two were about to step into the whirlpool, all the attacks came at once while the cloud in the sky sent countless lightning strikes down. Even the speed of the black light increased, contracting even faster. Wang Lin suddenly stood up and rushed forward. Originally, he didn't plan on getting within 300 feet, but now was a rare opportunity, and if he missed it now, he might regret it forever. Wang Lin's eyes showed extreme focus, as he formed dozens of illusionary circles that surrounded him. But right after, he suddenly stopped and just stared straight ahead, then slowly allowed the circles to disperse. Wang Lin forced himself to stop, because he knew that if he was struck by even one lightning bolt, he would be destroyed. It wasn't worth the risk. Also, 6 Desire Devil Lord and Ancient Emperor were both at the soul formation. He must not rush out. Although time is precious, the hatred the two held for him was deep. He might not be able to escape death. There was also the fact that if that black light wouldn't disappear on its own, he didn't have the confidence that he could break it. Wang Lin's heart calmed down as he stared at the two. He decided that he must be very cautious. As 6 Desire Devil Lord was about to enter the whirlpool, more than 10 lightning strikes came down. He quickly used the youth's body to block them, but was still hit by a few. He spit out a mouthful of blood. His cultivation was instantly decreased by 1 level permanently, and one of the arms of the youth body was sent flying by the lightning. However, 6 Desire Devil Lord clenched his teeth and disappeared into the whirlpool. As the arm flew out, it hit the black light and began to smoke. Once it landed outside the black light, there was no longer any flesh or blood on it. What remained was the bone with specks of golden light on it. However, the bone was broken. It seemed the black light was even able to damage the bone. Meanwhile, Ancient Emperor was also targeted by more than 10 lightning balls. His 8 flags scattered. He had to sacrifice 4 of the flags as he rushed into the whirlpool. However, one of the lightning balls followed him closely and hit him right as he entered the whirlpool. The black ring diffused until 300 feet, then suddenly disappeared. Wang Lin's forehead was full of cold sweat. He checked the restrictions at 300 feet from the top and immediately noticed the difference. Wang Lin returned to his boulder and sat down. When he first saw the golden spots, he immediately thought of the golden bone that emerged from Beastmaster's forehead. He looked at the bone and applied a little pressure. The bone had already been damaged by the lightning and the black light, thus it was extremely weak. Under Wang Lin's pressure, the bone cracked and shattered, leaving 8 grains of golden particles. There wasn't any sign of spiritual power on the bone. Wang Lin began to ponder. This video will end here. Thank you for watching.